Okay, thank you very much, Emma, and thanks a lot for this invitation to join a discussion on, actually, it's the latest book that I've put together with a group of people that I've been working with, called Contours of Feminist Political Ecology. And the subtitle I've just added now for this talk, which is Towards the Repair of Our Life Worlds, picking up on what Emma was saying about how we're having to deal with a whole range of crises. And I hope that in this talk, I'll be giving you something of a positive take on that, because I think the gloom and doom that we have to live with can get too much for our mental health and our well-being, particularly those of us with privileges that we must have, because we're here on internet with possibility to connect. And I think we also struggle with how do we deal with the kinds of inequalities we view, particularly, as we just said, in relation to maybe our care for the planet, but also our care for others, some of whose lives we don't see, but we recognize are there. So, sorry, I'm just going to have to move. So I'm very aware that as a professor, I have the privileges of having time to think and talk. And I had a 4-year project funded by the EU, which also gave me the privilege of working with a whole range of other people who are thinking through feminist political ecology. We did this in a project called Wellbeing, Ecology, Gender and Community. It was a training network, which means that we had 15 PhDs. And it was also something of a privilege to be therefore working with young women and men who will be having to live through longer than I do on many of the things that we're struggling with. The project, I should also mention, happened during COVID times. It's just completed. And that sort of disruption, which is caused by environment, climate, really made us think about health in the future years and the way we can understand care, and also how we can deal with economic and political crises which led to COVID. So I also wanted to underline that when we're thinking about issues of post-growth, or how we can create a future which is about repairing and living within limits, but also with a sense of well-being, we've got these last years to be really reflecting and thinking about, and not to forget what COVID taught us. So what I want to talk about in this 30 minutes is really try to give you a sense of what is feminist political ecology, and how in this book, but then in many of the conversations I've been with, we're trying to think through the importance of our life worlds, not just the importance of our gaining wealth, our gaining life or whatever, but actually how we are part of many different life worlds that we need to start to revalue in different ways, and not to dispossess those people who have some of the knowledges which we can be learning with, or dispossess nature and the more than human beings that we can also learn with. Now, feminist political ecology, people see as a sort of subset of political ecology, but I would say that it's actually moving beyond that kind of idea of political ecology to really go not just looking at resources, economic resources, ecological resources, but also the idea of where is reproduction, where is care, what sorts of boundaries do we have when we talk about life and death issues, and how can we recover our ways of relating differently with others. So in that sense, I see feminist political ecology not only as a set of sort of research ideas, but also as a set of strategies that are really trying to work beyond some of the confines that academia and research puts onto us, and really thinks about how we can work in solidarity with each other, rather than trying to, as I put here, reproduce mastery, which means basically trying to impose on others the ways in which we see the world. So I think this, for me, is what I'd like to explore with you. I hope you'll enjoy that. I wasn't sure the audience I'm talking to, so I have taken a little bit of time to say, what is feminist political ecology? as you can hear, I'm setting it not as a sort of academic discipline, but at the same time, it's really about trying to think about different ways of knowing how we can think through issues of politics and justice as an alternative to some of the dominant views on development, and particularly growth issues and also capitalist trajectories, so that we're not just looking at the big picture, but trying to look at some of the ways at the local levels, at the community level, we're doing transformative work, which is actually at the heart about how to create more equitable and just worlds. So the idea is to be really, as researchers or as people involved in different activism and then researching about that, trying to contribute to the collective anti-capitalist feminist struggle that is really trying to point out that we need to see other ways of how we can live economically and also ecologically. And the idea that we're trying to have not just one idea, one universal idea, but rather a pluriversal idea about how we can, in a sense, not just live well, but also flourish and thrive. So I was, as you invited me to do this talk, I was trying to think, well, what does feminist political ecology bring to post-capitalism and post-growth ideas? And I think what it's mostly bringing to it, I think in many ways it's in conversation, and it's evolving together with people who are thinking about post-capitalism and post-growth. But it does bring an intersectional and gendered understanding of how we have access to control over resources. And it's also trying to look at socioeconomic processes, understanding what are the gendered relationships and what are our subjectivities within that, so that it's not only about the big pictures, it's also about how we as communities, as individuals, respond in terms of the emotions we feel about what is happening in the world, also how we are positioned in what we can do and how things are happening in the world. And it's trying to link then the different scales, so moving from both a sort of micro to macro level of understanding of what is it that we're tackling when we're talking about needing to move beyond capitalism or beyond growth. And that is at the heart of it, really trying to look at the different injustices which are in the processes which inform capitalism, and look at it not just from the point of view of the oppressed, but also at the point of view of within different communities, how gender is played out, and some of the painfulness of that as well, to acknowledge the emotions and the difficulties of trying to change relationships within households, within communities, within institutions, within governments, that it's not just about pointing things out, but it's also about trying to get the sense and the feeling of what we can do. So in that sense, it's trying to bring the human and the subjective into what can sometimes just be the material and sort of critical look at the way in which we need to move forward. So in that sense, when I'm reflecting on the book that I'm really taking most of this from, well, the book that comes from 4 years and 5 years really of discussion with different people, the idea is that the way in which feminist political ecology emerges is not from some grand theory or framework, but rather it's coming from the different communities, the different political engagements, and is reflecting and thinking on those. So it's about really trying to be part of what it is that you're thinking and reflecting on. And in that sense, it's very much a commitment to gender, social and environmental justice. But at the same time, there isn't just one way of looking at that. It's by coming from different positions and different standpoints. It's also moving towards something that is much more than just talking about something like land, water, or extractivism. It's, as I said earlier, trying to really go into how we experience all of this and recognize that issues of the bodily pain, aging, and the ethics of how we relate to nature are just as much important as the sort of politics and economic systems that are happening. And we're also learning, and this is something I'll come to at the end, I think learning with some troubling ways, how to learn from what people call knowledge otherwise, so indigenous ontologies of co-becoming, together with the feminist perspectives around degrowth, decoloniality, and pluriversality. So as you can hear, it's a praxis, really. It's something that is trying to do as well as to think about some of the big issues that we're facing when we talk about post-capitalism and post-growth. I think at the central theme, and this is what Emma said at the beginning, is that we're really trying to look at the ethics and politics of care in research, in activism, in everyday life. So care is as a central value, and trying to understand what that means in these non-material aspects around political ecology. So paying attention to and noticing what care, love, solidarity, and reciprocity means for us as we think through what does it mean to talk about well-being and how can we flourish. So in that sense, in many ways, we're trying to bring into the conversation of post-capitalism and post-growth, that we need to pay attention to a range of things, including our bodies, our communities, and how gender, race, and class relate together. And that, for us, is also the only way of building a just, sustainable, and convivial society. So in that sense, it's a very collaborative and collective process, and it uses a whole range of methodologies, which would not be easily recognized, I think, by economists or ecologists. I know that from myself, from having to engage with different colleagues about why it is that during our project, we were doing things like co-curating exhibitions, using artistic and very visual and storytelling approaches to understanding what was happening in relation to land, water, food, energy, and bodies, and having to work across disciplines, drawing on personal intellectual journeys, histories, and experiences, so that really trying to recognize that knowledge, in order for us to change, needs to not just be about text and numbers, and understanding that these types of artistic expressions are also very important to what we can learn. I know that for those of you listening, you're not going to see the pictures I'm putting up. I'm not meant to have got them, I think, but according to me, people like Patricia Piccinini, I've got a picture there that she's done. These are the sorts of artistic ways of thinking that try to bring to the center different ways of understanding how we can live together, in the sense that we are not just about caring for humans, but also caring for others, more than humans. Trying to bring care to our life worlds means really displacing the idea of economics and growth as a central issue, and trying to look more at how we can live well sociologically and ecologically. And in that sense, needing to really imagine a very different way of living. The picture I have is of a kind of very friendly sort of monster, if you like, looking at a small child. And Piccinini tries to get us to embrace the more than human within us and outside through these imaginations. So the way that our project worked, apart from, as I said, the issue of COVID meant that we couldn't be doing the sort of research that we thought we'd be doing with communities. We nevertheless decided that we would be, we continued the project. Not all projects continued during COVID, but we decided to use storying as a method to understand how we can move beyond capitalism and growth. And we did that by linking different experiences of climate change, looking at different experiences of extraction and exploitation, and doing that by working with communities, and then based on the researchers' situated knowledges and their own lived experiences, then created a whole range of different kinds of conversations, whether in art, whether in podcasts, whether in exchange of experiences. So I wanted just to briefly talk about the idea of storying as method by giving some examples of what we did in the what we've got in the book, but also what we did in the project. I'm doing this partly because I think, well, we're here now on speaking on the internet and or through the internet, and I think that trying to explore different ways of sharing stories or sharing experiences via this sort of medium does open possibilities that actually we learned in COVID can be also very powerful. So the examples I'm giving, I'm just starting first of all with some of the PhDs that were part of the UN Climate Change Conference, as their research, actually trying to understand how they could bring into the exhibition the different stories that their communities were concerned about. So rather than sort of entering into a conference to give feedback to the policymakers or to the texts that were there, they wanted to create a space which enabled people to hear about the everyday lives of people who were dealing with climate change, who were concerned about how you could learn from that knowledge rather than the other way around, looking at the big pictures and then trying to say, this is because of these things that are happening at this level, we're trying to now explain to people at the local level what it is they should do. So in a way to explain, this is actually how climate change is impacting pastoralists, for example, in terms of what kinds of livings they can make due to climate change having shifted completely the ways in which they can make their own livings, or the way in which the waters have changed, the rivers have changed, or the ways in which they cannot take animals to places because the water is no longer there, etc. So bringing those sorts of stories directly into the conference, and also into acknowledging that these stories, small stories, are just as important as the bigger stories that were being told at the climate change, if we are going to understand how people can live through the kinds of disasters that we're going through now. Another one, and these are all chapters in the book that I've been speaking about. Another one is looking at particularly how age has changed. How aging women are having to live differently due to both depopulation. This is particularly in Japan, but also due to the kinds of very different worlds that they're having to survive in, and how they are working together in different communities where traditional family relations are no longer there because people have left, gone to the urban areas, or these elderly women living longer than their partners, etc. This is not only in Japan, but this particular study was very interesting in relation to how these women were completely changing the ways in which they related to each other, and how they also went back to work with different wheats, different types of grains in a different kind of relationship with the more than human. And it was also something there to be having to rethink the way in which we see age and the way in which we understand particularly people who are no longer are not being perceived as part of citizenship, how it is that you can acknowledge and understand and learn from the ways in which they're experiencing aging. So that was one study. Another study that also looked at the importance of bodies and the issues of illness was looking at how pain and illness is also part of our experience of change, and something that we need to also understand as we're going to be increasingly having to deal with aging, and increasingly recognizing the ways in which climate is impacting on the health on our bodies. And this is something that, again, this particular conversation was a very honest one about how these three women were living with different illnesses and different forms of pain, and acknowledging that pain is also part of needing to understand life as we're living it. I think this is very much reflected in how we've all gone through COVID as well. So I have a few more examples. This is another one that comes, as you can tell, this is a whole range of different experiences on different scales. And the point of the book is that we've got these pluriversal ways of understanding the changes that are happening around us. In this one, the researcher was working in Mexico City and looking at how market women perceive solar energy in the future. But instead of doing a survey and asking them, what do you think? And assuming that they don't understand what solar energy would bring, she instead involved them in a conversation about what kind of futures, environmental futures, do they want, and how their knowledge and understanding of and hopes for their future could be brought into a very different kind of understanding of what energy futures are about. She devised, because it was during COVID, an app in her research. But the important thing here, I think, is that this kind of storying and listening to people's everyday lives, people's hopes and futures, is also part of how we need to be shifting into a post-growth, post-capitalist future. It's a very, I think, hopeful and generative way of listening to people and taking what their perception of the futures is also important, not only policymakers or people that have been sort of within different institutions that give them the power to speak. It's also to be listening to those voices and working with their imaginations and understandings of what energy could look like. Then I think one of the things we also have been doing, of course, is trying to think through some of the big issues as well. And the population question was one of them. And there was, I think, in feminist thinking, population control or trying to reduce, women having children has been for many years anathema. And in this chapter, we really looked at whether it's possible to think about reproductive justice, not only with in the sense of humans, how many children you have, but also in relation to how you could be kinning with other creatures, with more than humans. And of course, this is an idea that is coming also from indigenous peoples for many years. Kinning is something that is part and parcel of the ways in which they live with the world. But in this case, we were looking at Donna Haraway, who's a well-known feminist scholar, science and technology scholar, really caused a stir by also raising this as an issue for feminists to consider. So we were looking at those sorts of issues, not only in relation to the actual question, but also in relation to how one can engage within a group of scholars or within a community and try to talk about things which are difficult to talk about, which is indeed what we need to be doing as we deal with the need to go beyond what we think is normal. So I hope, so that just gives you a glimpse. I should have mentioned the book is available open access, so it's downloadable for free. That's also part of the benefit and the privilege of being part of an EU project. But I think what I'm trying to give here is that feminist political ecology is using storying as a way to move us beyond the sort of big picture framing of the crisis we're in, and to try and learn from our bodies, from relations with ourselves, with different communities, and really pay attention to care work and valuing care for humans and the more than humans as part of a way to forge a more just and sustainable and convivial society, and doing it with care in itself, but also paying attention to small things, so that and to also see that those small stories also are as important as the big story pictures as well. So just to conclude, I also wanted to raise that, of course, in any set of conversations or discourses, there's always issues that also arise, as well as trying to tell the stories. And I just thought maybe this is useful for our conversations. One of the outstanding issues that we have, as I would say that we're still meeting as a network, although the project has finished, but we're very conscious that feminist political ecology is a very white group of people, but also perhaps way of thinking, and the kind of Eurocentrism of the scholars, even though we're trying to work that through, that's something that I think we're having to learn from decolonial feminist scholars, and also the whole issue of post-colonialism. Feminist political ecology is aware, or at least within the book, I should say, aware of those sorts of histories, but not really constructing the conversations around those histories. And that's something that's important to deal with beyond the actual whiteness of the group, in the sense of trying to look at how race, including whiteness, constructs the ways in which we've been talking about care, for example, or kinning. There's also the whole issue of the material realities that we're looking at. There's the inequalities are also very economic, and there's huge differences in terms of access to resources, and the impact of climate on different groups. And there's that reality, which, as I said at the beginning, can overwhelm and maybe make it very difficult to be positive and try to move towards creative thinking otherwise. So there's a sort of contrast or dilemma there. And then I think maybe this is something that any scholar or activist working in the global north is aware of, is that it's very difficult to be bringing in or talking in solidarity with communities without also appropriating their stories and knowledge in ways that, just because of where you are situated, are difficult to avoid. So I think that's something that's very important when we're thinking of sort of post-capitalist futures. And then, as you can hear, I think there's also a tension within what kind of knowledge are we trying to produce, knowledge that is understandable by others, or knowledge that is academically certified, if you like. And I think that's also a kind of tension within feminist political ecology as well, and possibly also in all of our ways of going forward when we're talking within our own circle. Once you try to step outside, then how do you communicate and make clear the kinds of concerns that you have? Okay, so thank you. That's what I wanted to share. And thanks very much, Emma.
Thank you so much, Professor Harcourt, for this intervention. It was really enlightening on the process of making the book and how to work with feminist political ecology. I, of course, have some questions, but I'm sure you also have some, so please do write them in the chat and I'll make sure that we get to them. While you think and write, I'll start by asking a couple. And I really want to ask you about the ways of thinking that feminist political ecology is in opposition to or reacting to what you call this big picture thinking or neoclassical political economy or statistics, or how you want to frame it. I don't know if you would like to put some more words to what has this non-specific, non-subjective way of thinking, how has that shaped the solutions that we've tried to come up with for these issues, and how does feminist political ecology differ from that?
Oh, thanks, Emma. That's a great question. For me, I think there are different ways of answering it. There's a sort of very radical way of answering it, which is saying that white patriarchy, sort of male gaze has really shaped everything that we're dealing with, including how we're working on the internet, no doubt. And it's such a dominant knowledge that we often don't even see it. So because we just assume, well, that's how things are. I mean, we of course have to compare countries through GDP, because how else are we going to understand the world? Or of course, the main goal of my life is to earn enough money to get a whole range of consumables, because what else am I here for? Because I need all of these things. So these are so fundamentally ingrained, it's hard to unpack them and to try to say, well, actually, there are other ways of valuing life, including as I said, care or love or solidarity. And the whole issue, as soon as you say that, people will say, oh, but you're romantic, or you're yeah, or you're that's just not realistic. I mean, come on, you know, you need a salary as much as anyone else, or you know, it's all very well for you to be critical of that, but you also benefit from all the things that you're saying we need to be looking at differently. So I think it's a big argument, in the sense of a big discussion. On the other hand, right now, I think people are beginning to see that you do have to, it's not like it was, and this is where my age comes in, let's say in the 90s, when neoliberalism was really on the rise. People are starting to see, including economists, are starting to realize that you do have to not only look at GDP, you do, I mean, we've just had, you know, the world happiness, and apparently the Finnish are the happiest in the world. I don't know how they get to that. If any of you, I don't know, if any of you are from Finland, maybe you could enlighten us. But and Afghanistan is the least happy. I mean, again, you're getting into comparisons and competition almost, which is not very helpful. The point is, how do we all sort of work together and live together? So in terms, particularly in terms of the sort of comparing populations and states and different people, I think that can be very dangerous. But I think it's in the sense that we then don't see possibilities to change, because we're so caught up in the numbers and the figures. So for me, in a small way, feminist politicology is trying to look at the small everyday, the emotions, the impacts, the feelings that people have, and say they're also valuable. And we need to also look into those and not just dismiss them as anecdotal or not real or opinions only, because everything is opinions only.
I want to ask you, there are no questions in the chat yet, which is good for me, so I can just continue asking my questions. But please do write in the chat if you'd like. I want to ask you about, because actually, for some reason, even though I've been very concerned with feminist economics for a long time, you mentioning the elderly and aging population actually is something that does not come up much. Oftentimes we talk a lot about the care for children and sometimes the ill, but the elderly seem to kind of fall out of the conversation oftentimes. I want to ask you if you can kind of deepen how do you feel like, what status or what's the way we conceive of the elderly today, and in a society more influenced by feminist political ecology, how would that change?
Okay, so again, a very key question. When I was thinking about research I would want to do, the idea of challenging the concept of successful aging was one of them, because there's also, in the same way, you know, we have these ideals of Western-based ideals of what is the perfect family or what is the way in which one should live. Successful aging is part of it, so that there's this idea that if you should age well. So there's a whole industry around looking young, or basically avoiding, if you do become ill, if you do need these things, then something's gone wrong with you, right? And there's a whole industry around trying to also, and this is again, you can't just generalize, but the idea that older people are not much use in society, so that particularly those without families should be in care homes. There's not an idea of older people being able to be part of society because we've got such a youth culture. So there's several issues there that there's 2 studies from which are in the book looked at, which was first of all challenging the idea that old people are not able to be part of a society that would welcome their views, their wisdom. Again, learning from indigenous societies and other sort of non-Western societies, often age is seen as a respectful thing. And so trying to respect and learn from older people and their wisdom rather than seeing them as costing a lot of money or needing to be put into homes or being pensioners and taking money from young people who are working. So the idea of recognizing who they are, at the same time not putting pressure on them to successfully age as if they should stay young forever. Also allow for age to be a different time, a welcome time, not a time to be ashamed of, and something that you could design a world very differently if you A, saw aging people as valuable, and B, recognize that as you age, you need more support. And that's something not to be feared, but to be welcomed. And there could be ways in which we see that as a good part of life, not a life that we dread. In other words, for me, it's also recognizing that age and death, for that matter, is part of life, and try to see that whole continuity and life cycle as very important, not just in a medical way, but in a social way. And also, in a sense, you can think of many things that older people are able to do in terms of caring for children of others, caring for their grandchildren, caring for the earth, keeping the wisdom that they've had in terms of how they lived and learned from different relations with nature or with other people. So I think it's a very powerful and important idea to be looking at aging in a different way. And as you say, it's not been on many feminist ways of thinking. It's sort of because of I mostly hear people say, oh, we just finished looking after our children, now we have to look after our aging parents. So not seeing those relationships as important or valuable, but as burdens.
I want to ask you about COVID as well, because when I'd been interested in feminist economics for a long time, and then when COVID hit, I also saw a possibility, because suddenly people were talking about care workers and understanding kind of their centrality in societal infrastructure. But of course, you were working transnationally in your group. And I want to ask you a little bit more about what COVID meant for your ways of approaching these issues.
Yeah, I guess many of us in those early days were so shocked at what was going on. Those of us in particularly urban areas in Europe. I think it took a while for us to realize that actually care and relationships are what were going to help us survive, right? Not only nurses that was there, but what people were seeing as sort of essential workers. It was a bit of a shock to realize essential workers were not the banks and all of that. So we saw that, right? And we thought, aha, finally people are going to value things differently. But then we watched that fade away pretty quickly, because many people became also reliant on fast foods, on fast deliveries, all sorts of other kinds of things started, which were greatly benefiting capitalist system, and the idea of relationships and being at home. Some relationships were also falling apart. So there was I think mental health emerged as maybe the big thing that everybody had to suddenly recognize. But at the same time, it depended where you were. I work in the Netherlands. There was a lot of recognition of that and a lot of support. Whereas people I know living in Italy, there was no support at all. I don't know everything. I haven't studied that at all. But this was all in the global north. In the global south, to some extent, there was completely different, very material concerns. that again, I haven't looked at it. I've read. You probably know better than I do, Emma. I think it's put a huge amount of burden on all sorts of people in a very different way. They didn't have the supports from the state that, at least in the Netherlands and to some extent in Italy, the two places where I was during COVID, they had. So it really depends on where you were. And I think those original early hopes for now the world would change. And, you know, remember this idea of a new portal opening up that Arundhati Roy proposed. It felt really possible, but I think that portal seems to have closed, given where we are now politically and economically. Yeah, maybe you should answer that question actually, if you.
Yeah, I think certainly many care workers and other people who were especially visible during COVID were very optimistic about the attention that they were getting, but have been very disappointed by how quickly it has disappeared. So I think there's certainly human beings are extremely adaptable. I think we find that we can adapt to quite unbelievable situations, but then we can also adapt back very quickly and forget. Our memory is very short, is something that I've been thinking about for a while now. And there's a question in the chat as well that I think is really interesting about how feminist political ecology, a question from Rolf, how feminist political ecology relates to other types of anti-capitalist struggle. Rolf mentions, for example, Nancy Fraser's 3 phases of labor: the exploited, the expropriated, and the domesticated. That has also been a framework that I have found quite useful. Where do you see feminist political ecology colliding and working well with other types of anti-capitalist struggle, and where does it separate itself?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's collide is a big word. I would say it's more working with and building on these sorts of struggles. We in the group I was in, we were engaging with degrowth conversations and found that resonated because they're also concerned with care. But we found that they were. I mean, we had very dynamic, interesting conversations, but where it differed was our focus on feminism and particularly understanding of social reproduction. It's not that it differed; it differed in a sense of social reproduction and women's work and trying to learn from indigenous peoples. I think that was not so much the interest of, well, that it was not what the people that we were talking with in growth circles were so interested in, or rather they were moving in their sort of European context. I think it also differs in that perhaps what might be seen as more ecofeminist interests in being with nature and learning from nature, the idea that you can talk about learning from rivers or learning from trees. I think that also differs a bit from Nancy Fraser's more materialist points of view. So bringing in nature as an agent and learning from its agency, I think, is something that feminist political ecology is trying to do in different ways. Perhaps also trying to learn from the global south as a place of knowledge, which is slightly different again from Nancy Fraser's work, which is excellent, and working with her understanding of capitalism, coming from, you know, a great deal of knowledge from, you know, being based in the States and being, you know, a great theorist from there. I think sort of decolonial scholars were also reading in different ways. Don't know. So I think these conversations, yeah.
Yeah, here's another question. I just need to read it. I'm just going to read from Asker here. I applaud the necessary focus on language, but shouldn't we be careful about talking about Western values and whiteness as immutable colossus of cold obtuseness? I understand what you mean, but isn't it also in many ways the values of the West that ensure that we can all have this conversation?
Yeah, of course, that's right. But at the same time, that's the sort of dilemma that's I was trying to point to, that the privileges that allow us to speak come out of, actually come out of a military sort of invention called the internet, which has been adapted and adopted and changed, but has all sorts of dangerous things, risks, etc. there. So I guess what I would say is that we have to be conscious of these things and unpack them and look at them. That doesn't mean you reject them, but it means you have to be aware of the risks you take. I'm sure we all feel that when we have iPhones and think, well, it's worth my while to have the iPhone, but I know all my data is being taken, but we're not quite sure what that means. And I think that's what Feminist with Ecology is pointing, well, not particularly that example, but is trying to think through, well, what does it mean, and what do we accept and what do we change? And we still feel that we've got that option.
I think I want to ask. Oh, sorry.
No.
I want to ask maybe a question that connects a little bit to Asger's question, which is the position of humans, of being human, not even being only a white human, but just being human on the planet. I think Haraway has written about this, but I'm really interested in how you were working through this. What do you did you find in your group to be the most fruitful, to perceive human beings as being equal to every other species, or to acknowledge that human beings are a terrifically powerful species and thus also have a specific responsibility? I think this gives for some, and this goes for, of course, whiteness and money as well. How does one acknowledge and use the power and privilege that one has, while simultaneously acknowledging that it is there for unjust reasons? Because there's, as you said in your introduction, also always the fear of reproducing the mastery that you're trying to get rid of.
Yeah, so there's that famous idea of bell hooks, that you can't, sorry, Audre Lorde, that you can't dismantle the master's house with his tools. But I think that isn't, for me, that's not helpful. I think that Haraway has for years now tried to make us think from somebody who's in the belly of the beast, and trying to also acknowledge where she is, but and some of the tools that are useful for dismantling are there, but at the same time trying to learn from outside of the belly of the beast, if you like, and being in dialogue with different knowledges. With all the difficulties of whiteness or language or whatever, which I agree with, are something to puzzle through. I'm Australian and coming, so a white settler context, and then trying to learn from peoples who, First Nations peoples who have been massacred, and that history not even being recognized, and are now struggling to get their voice into a constitution that is also now being challenged by white settlers, saying that, oh, you know, we're not, why should you have a special place in the constitution when they've been, they were not even considered humans until 1965. In another referendum that was then gave them citizenship and gave them human status before. So I think these are all very difficult questions, but they're also ones that we need to be talking about, perhaps sort of in a context specific way. And I think Donna Haraway tries to do that in a way that is also storying. So it's also telling stories that help us to think that through, not just sort of sticking to the, we probably need to know the figures and the facts of what's happened, but actually trying to move beyond them and not getting stuck into them. Not sure if I answered your question. I got a bit lost there. Anyhow.
Did you want to say something, Matthias, or? I just thought I saw you raising your hand.
No, yeah, but I actually do have a question.
Go ahead.
So a lot of these things that you have mentioned about like using stories to tell, like to bring forward like these different perspectives of various stakeholders. I mean, we think a lot about like how feminist political ecology can be used to like reshape business, because like I guess businesses reproduce and enforce a lot of institutions and capitalism that are kind of unsustainable. So I was just wondering whether your group or you have looked into how feminist political ecology can reshape, or have like what implication this approach or perspective have for businesses.
That's a good question, and I think because we are mostly people working within development institutions, and therefore in these sorts of policies of human rights and how inequality and injustice are sort of at the core of the concerns. We see businesses as maybe small scale businesses as something to be looked at in terms of the communities, and recognizing that there are many sorts of economies at this small scale level, many forms of economic behavior at the small scale level which needs to be brought in. So again, it goes back to that story of saying there are lots of different economic behaviors and communities which we need to see as also part of the ways in which people are needing to live, not only let's say the market and these bigger corporations. So there's that argument. And then the other one is to say, well, corporations are made up of relations, made up of people who could also be very concerned with justice issues. So yes, there's been one study that's looking, for example, at fishing communities and small scale fisheries and what happens there. But in terms of tackling sort of big corporations, I don't to some extent, no. I think feminist ecology is trying to look at the local and the everyday as a source of knowledge. So it could be looking at how institutions, big corporations behave within particular contexts, but it's not. There's one PhD student I know who is looking at that sort of behavior and how that can change, and those sorts of studies, looking at institutions. But that isn't part of our conversation, certainly not in the book that I'm speaking about or in the project, because I think people are suspicious of green economies and corporate social responsibility, so maybe that is an area to look at. Also, feminist ecology, very small numbers of people probably feeling that they need to be doing research on places which are normally invisible, and businesses are very visible. So maybe that's something of an answer.
We're kind of closing in on the last couple of minutes. So if you do have a question, I also want to note that Four Rivers has given an answer to Asker as well in the chat, if you want to check that out. But I want to ask you also, because you mentioned this, Wendy, that you feel like compared to where political economy was in the 90s, that there is an openness now to kind of heterodox ways of thinking about economics, and a new way to restructure society, maybe especially because of the climate and the biodiversity crises that are becoming so incredibly visible in these years. And I want to ask you kind of, how does one make the most of those kind of cracks in the system, both as an activist and as a scholar, or we have people here who are working in many different ways with challenging existing norms in political economy. How does one make the most of these cracks and possibilities that these changes are presenting?
I think it's by working collaboratively with others, and probably having conversations like this one. I joined or tried to work with the degrowth community to see how to open up that particular crack in the Benelux area in Europe, and trying to understand which communities are wanting to make those changes, and then to support them with different kinds of, if you like, stories or research that can then help them take that to another level. I think actually you need to open the cracks also in government, and that's also part of the work. I mean, in government, in people who are making policy. I think degrowth is now, for example, taking on the issue of the state, and also now doing a lot of teaching in academia and trying to get out good policy briefs. So maybe that's sort of literally opening the crack by not being afraid to say that, yes, it doesn't work. We can't continue this way. We need to move beyond what apparently is normalized, and use the fact that you've got very articulate people who can push that forward, but you can also be learning from what communities are doing right now. In, as I was saying before, the small economic behaviors, you can highlight that and say, well, this is also how people are working. In COVID, there were some very positive examples of how people were supporting each other and creating recycling shops. People are now very conscious of the need to change their consumer habits. So I think the cracks are opening, and it's a matter of going in there in all sorts of ways and to link up with others who are doing it.
Thank you so much, Professor Wendy Harcourt from the Erasmus University in The Hague, for this enlightening speech and for taking the time to answer our questions as well. This was the second to last talk in the Beyond Growth series. The last one will be on April 12th, and it will be called From Downscaling to Global Justice on the Need of Linking Climate Reparations and Degrowth. It's going to be by Matthias Schmelzer from the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. Please do tune in. It's also going to be at 5 p.m. and just take an hour. Thank you all for your time, and have a wonderful Easter or Ramadan or whatever you are celebrating. If none of it, just have a wonderful week and afternoon. And thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much, Matthias, for fixing and making everything work. And thank you so much, Wendy. My name is Emma Holten.
Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.